Good morning, everybody. You are listening. Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell. It is Tuesday morning, the 6th day of January, 2026. More on Venezuela, more on Maduro, more on missiles to Germany. And I was asked a question, actually this morning, by someone who wanted to know why I don't support Trump more than I do. After having, of course, voted for the man, why am I not more in support of what he's doing? I hope by the time this morning's program is over, I will be able to answer that question by merely looking at his behavior and what he's done in direct contradiction to what he promised a year ago during his campaign. So the follow-on continues to the U.S. attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of its president, Maduro, and his wife from Caracas. The two were arraigned yesterday. As you know, I think there were as many as 12 counts before a federal judge in New York, each declaring their innocence. The next court action is not for more than 2 months away. So Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in yesterday as well. And she made some rather vague, mild statements about cooperating in the context of terror in her nation and the Caribbean that's going on. And the death count from the U.S. Airstrikes in action in Venezuela is reported at 80 so far, with, interestingly enough, 32 of them are deceased Cuban nationals. So the drilling and the conveyance of oil in the nation of Venezuela is at a near standstill because the tank farms, the tankers that are at anchor, have reached their limit to be able to store any more crude. And given the U.S. blockade of shipping, these ships are not allowed to leave. They're just sitting there brimming over with oil, waiting for the blockade to lift so that they can deliver. And of course, they're going to be delivering oil to countries that are not in favor with what's happened. And remember, this whole thing in Venezuela is not about oil. It's about keeping China and Russia out of our hemisphere. President Trump intends to host U.S. oil executives in Miami, Florida here shortly to take over in the name of rebuilding in Venezuela. President Trump also the other night said that Colombia and Mexico are next in line for U.S. intervention if Washington so decides, along with the takedown of Cuba. That's part of the reason why I have a hard time supporting this man. This is not the role of the United States. This is not the intent of the founders of this country. So last evening, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy Stephen Miller likewise declared on CNN that the United States should have Greenland. That's exactly what he said. It's not enough to have Venezuela. Now we want Greenland. Trump said that Colombia, quote, is run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States. And he's not going to be doing it for very long, let me tell you. And then he said of Mexico that in every single call I have ever offered troops to President Claudia Sheinbaum in order to deal with the cartels. So, of particular danger to the United States, the plan that has been going on for some time to be unfolded in 2026 was the placing of nuclear-capable long-range missiles in Germany this year. That is a red line for which the Russians have said, we will have to go after those missile bases, whether they're in the Ukraine or not. And yet, the move is still to move medium range, which means they can reach Moscow and St. Petersburg and other places in eastern Russia. especially military targets, with American-made missiles, the Typhoon and the Tomahawks. Another reason why I have a hard time supporting Trump, because he promised to end what was going on in the Ukraine, just as he promised to end what was going on in Gaza. Yet he still continues to support the genocide in Gaza, and he still supports monetary as well as weaponry to Ukraine. Oh yeah, but Jack, not directly. No, he sells these weapons to the neighboring countries of the coalition of the willing, who then sell them to the Ukraine with the money that we gave them. Now you call that what you want. I call it supporting the war against Russia. Another reason why I have a hard time supporting the man. So the drilling and the conveyance of oil in Venezuela, as I said, is sitting there at a standstill in the midst of the January 5th emergency meeting of the UN Security Council yesterday. Lasted over 3 hours. I don't know if you've seen any of the speakers. You can go to YouTube under Jeffrey Sachs and see his 12-minute, 15-minute presentation to the UN Security Council. Very, very good. I've been a long admirer of Professor Jeffrey Sachs. But there were dozens of nations that got together, of course, to express their condemnation of the United States' unilateral invasion and takeover of Venezuela. Professor Sachs, who's a regular on the Napolitano podcast series, outlined the wrongful regime change actions by the United States over the past decades, not just Venezuela. And all of these other states that we took over for whatever published reason. Of course, we were there for their resources. How they're failed states today. I don't have to list them. You know who they are. And Venezuela is going to join it. For example, one of them, Uganda, that spoke on behalf of the 120 nation non-aligned movement, gave a very strong statement representing the group of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter, I think is what it was called, which was founded alongside a UN meeting back in 2021, condemning U.S. actions against all of these countries that are incapable of defending themselves against our aggression. He pointed out that President Trump on January 3rd, when he claimed to occupy and govern Venezuela, was confessing a clear plan, I'm quoting Sachs, confessing a clear plan of annexation that foresees, among others, the complete obliteration of the inalienable rights of the Venezuelan state as a whole. And then among members of this association that were speaking out against this, Russia and China, of course, Belarus, Iran, Mali, and Venezuela. So at the same time the UN Security Council meeting was taking place, Chinese President Xi Jinping issued his first personal comments on Venezuela in the course of a meeting with visiting Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin. Xi Jinping said this: "The world today is undergoing changes and turbulence not seen in a century, with unilateral acts of hegemony that seriously undermine the international order. All countries must respect the developmental paths independently chosen by the people of their nations and comply with international law and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. And the major powers in particular must set an example in this regard." Now, Article 2 of the UN Charter, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it condemns what exactly the U.S. did with Venezuela. And as of the time of putting this stuff together, there was a very classified briefing on U.S. actions in Venezuela for the first time by the Trump administration to the 8+ congressional leaders of the two chambers, in particular armed services and intelligence committees. Many of the lawmakers, of course, are very highly critical of Trump's intervention. But unfortunately, only because Congress wasn't briefed in advance, nor had it given any authorization for the U.S. military buildup. Not because the lawmakers opposed the takeover of Venezuela and the takeover of other nations. only because they weren't told in advance. Oh, you got to love this. You just have to love this. So the United States plans to station intermediate range missiles, the SM-6, the Tomahawk, and a hypersonic weapon such as the Dark Eagle. I don't know a whole lot about it, but apparently the United States finally has a hypersonic, and they plan on staging these in Germany this year. These weapons, these systems, are being deployed by the 56th U.S. Artillery Command, which was reactivated in November 2020 in Wiesbaden. I've been to Wiesbaden. It still looks like it's in the 1600s. Anyway, the SM-6 has a range of 370 to 500 kilometers. The Tomahawk cruise missile is capable of penetrating enemy territory at low altitude and taking out command centers, bunkers, and radar installations, while the Dark Eagle is a hypersonic weapon capable of 17 times the speed of sound and still maneuverable as it approaches its target. These systems are nuclear capable and can be launched from Germany against strategic targets, as I said earlier, deep in Russian territory, to hit Russian command centers, among other targets. There's another reason why I can't support Trump. He has no business doing this. And it's to the point now where he has vacillated and flip-flopped so much with what he has discussed with Putin, especially since the Anchorage meeting this last summer, that the Russians are not going to trust anything that comes out of Trump's mouth or anybody else representing the United States of America. These decisions like this to install these kinds of systems in Germany not only makes Germany a nuclear target, as the Russian Federation has said clearly. It's been described as a cuckoo's egg. It was foisted upon then-Chancellor Olaf Scholz back in summer of 2024 at a NATO summit in Washington by President Biden, and then put in by President Trump's group once he got in there. And now it threatens at the very least to sabotage the diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine, and it could at least, at the worst case, lead to war in Europe, because the Russians are not going to sit down. They're just not going to sit down at any kind of a meeting to discuss bringing this war to an end when the United States is still actively talking about delivering these missiles to Germany. So at this summit, back in July of 2024, Putin warned that Russia would take a mirror image, he used that term, mirror image step, and deploy its own intermediate range weapons. And we know they're in Belarus. And we know that there are Oreshniks in Belarus. And there's Oreshniks in Kaliningrad. That's just a little leap and a hop over Poland into Germany. Actually, Kaliningrad's even closer than that. This could create a situation even more dangerous than what existed in the early 1980s during the medium-range missile crisis back then, when both Pershing II and SS-20 missiles were permanently put on launch on warning. And the warning time from launch to target was reduced as little as 4 minutes. I mean, at that time, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in Germany because they recognized the threat with such extremely short warning times. And then a third world war, I mean, this time by nuclear war, could wipe out the entire human race by accident simply because they're on launch on warning. So today the situation, I think, is even more dangerous because the communication channels that were in place even during the Cuban Missile Crisis have been reduced to just a handful of people. The deployment of these systems will make Germany a prime target for its first strike in any escalation. And if that happens, even with non-nuclear tipped Oreshniks in critical sites, Germany will be wiped off the map. And so the stationing of these kinds of U.S. weapons would represent a danger all the greater as the so-called coalition of the willing, that group we've come to love and know as United Kingdom, France, and Germany, as well as the EU Commission, are on a sweeping militarization drive right now. I've talked about it over several shows where their social programs are hurting. Their infrastructure programs are hurting because money is being diverted away from that to militarization. And we're right there with them. Another reason why I can't support Trump. Ostensibly because Russia is preparing an attack on the NATO member states. That's what they say. We've got to build this up because Russia is going to expand beyond Ukraine and take over the rest of Europe. When every political, military, economic expert that I have even a half of a faith of trust in say that's absolutely ridiculous. That's the last thing Russia wants. And this assertion is in total contradiction with the statement of the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. You remember who that is? That lady you never hear from anymore because she's kept in the shadows, Tulsi Gabbard? She said the U.S. intelligence assesses that Russia seeks to avoid a larger war with NATO. Russia does. This is the head, the Director of National Intelligence, who earlier this year said that is the last thing that Russia wants to do, based on all the intelligence she can gather. Russia doesn't want that. Russia moved into the Donbass and Donetsk in order to save the lives of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine who are being systematically destroyed by a Kiev Nazi government. I don't have to go over this again. I've gone over this so many times. So, which of course would trigger this war would trigger the implementation of NATO's collective defense clause under Article 5. And then she further said on X that the U.S. intelligence also assesses Russia's battlefield performance shows that it does not have the capability to conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, let alone Europe. And that's a given. Nobody argues that, really. What Russia has done, the best remember, Ukraine's as big as Texas. And what the Russian army has done, slowly acquiring, of course they're acquiring at rapid speeds now, Ukrainian territory, because the Ukrainian army hardly exists anymore, except in a few enclaves that are totally surrounded by the Russian army, waiting for them to surrender so they don't have to be destroyed. Right up to the Dnieper River. And Zaporizhzhia is next. And so her assessments were, as you look at what the Russian army has done since 2022, 4 years this March, demonstrates how long it's taken for them to get to where they are. They don't have the capability to take over the rest of the Ukraine, let alone Europe. Therefore, the stationing of these missiles into Germany would have the effect of destroying the chances for a successful outcome of the negotiations between the Trump administration and the Russian government as far as the normalization of relations are concerned. And given the current rapid escalation of the disintegration of the international legal order, in which the principle of might makes right has replaced international law, where a genocide identified by the International Court of Justice is committed before the eyes of the world, with drones attack on daily, censorship in our country now growing to the point where it threatens the freedom of expression, civil rights suspended, and a state of just overall lawlessness threatens. This deployment could be the last straw of strategic destabilization. This year, America will be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Not the birth of the country, if you consider the ratification of the Constitution as the official birth of the country, but of the Declaration. And you could argue that that's when America began, with Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, which ended up sealing its victory in the first anti-colonial war against the British Empire. And the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution represents an absolute historic watershed that established the general welfare of the American people and the right to a government committed to that general welfare, as it says in the beginning of that sacred document. In one of the most famous and welfare it doesn't mean monthly checks. That's not what the founders meant when they said welfare. It's the overall situation where you are safe and secure in your home. That was the general welfare. What was necessary to provide the general welfare was a small, efficient federal government recognizing the sovereign is the citizens, not the government, through the representation that is provided in the Constitution. And that to promote the general welfare was to promote the overall goodness and prosperity of the citizens of that nation. That's all it meant. Now, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, said this July 4th, 1821. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She's the champion and the vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general clause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. you imagine her political leadership talking like that. America not only established with its revolution of 1776 the model of a sovereign republic, it also created, with Alexander Hamilton's American system of economics, an economic model that serves the general welfare and has been applied in all countries that have successfully carried out an industrial revolution. With the system that Washington and Hamilton put together to encourage industry and the establishment of a greater control by the public sector, the private sector, of business, manufacturing, agriculture, shipbuilding, canal building through American credit, was able to pay off the revolutionary debt to the Netherlands and France and other countries by the end of Washington's second term. That's how prosperous America became. And not least, the German economist Friedrich List took up in his writings the fundamental difference between the American system and the British system, which the British system is solely based on profits for the speculators and the financial oligarchy. And ever since 1917, and you know what happened then, the British system has completely regained control of its colonies, so that the profits then, of course, go to the speculators and the financial oligarchy. And the history of America since its founding has been marked by the British Empire's attempts to reverse the success of the American Revolution. But after the War of 1812 and the Civil War, in which Great Britain was allied with the Confederate States, proved that this was impossible by military means. They could not conquer us militarily. And it proved that this was the continuing need of the British imperial circles repeatedly to attempt to persuade the American establishment to adapt the model of the British Empire and establish a unipolar world order based on the special Anglo-American relationship. And that's how we got in this mess we're in now. On the proud occasion of the 250th anniversary of this republic, should be taken as an occasion to revive the ideals of the tradition of the American Revolution, and in the tradition of John Quincy Adams, to support partnership with sovereign nations around the world. So, it's my intent as a citizen of this republic to appeal to the sovereign power of the United States of America, the American people, as well as President Trump, who I still recognize as the legitimate president of the United States, just as I recognized him as the legitimate president of the United States in the election of 2020, to reverse the Biden administration's highly dangerous decision and not install any new weapons on German soil. It can only lead to horror. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That just went out the window with what happened in Venezuela. All men, I didn't say American men, American women, American children, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the UN Security Council wasted no time in condemning what the United States had done with Venezuela, threats to international peace and security, they called it. The meeting, there was a meeting, well, the meeting was called by Colombia, because Colombia knows it's next. They're not stupid. And it was backed by Russia and China and South Africa. And there were several harsh condemnations of the U.S. attack by several of the member states, as well as a very hard-hitting presentation by American economist Jeffrey Sachs, and you can go to YouTube and see that, who went back decades ago and brought it up to the now, the history of the United States doing what it did with Venezuela. Now, when I was asked, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, why I can't be more supportive of Trump, don't make the critical mistake that Trump is in charge. The neocons are in charge. Who are they? Whenever you see President Trump stand up to make some big announcement, General Kane standing there, Marco Rubio is standing there, Pete Hegseth is standing there, and in the background, others start to show up to tell you who's really in charge, every bit as much as it was in the Biden administration. So when I'm asked why can't I be more supportive of Trump, it's the neocons who are in charge, not Trump. I'm afraid he has met the deep state, and he's found out he's part of it. I know what that sounds like. Trump names his next three targets, with the U.S. Commerce Secretary Lutnick and Lindsey Graham, Lindsey Bring on the Wars Graham, leering from the sidelines. President Trump bragged in reporters on Air Force One on his, and it's interesting how much Lindsey Graham is on Air Force One with the president. Anyway, on their way back to Washington on Sunday, President Trump says Colombia, Mexico, and Cuba are next in his sights, including for military action. Can you imagine? Can you imagine military action against Mexico? Trump called Colombia a very sick country, just like Venezuela. He said, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States. And he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you. As he spoke of course, Colombian President Gustavo Petro having cocaine mills and cocaine factories. Yeah, we know this. We know this. And why does that happen? Because of the market that exists in the United States. Oh, no, it's because all these drugs get to flow across Mexico, across the Rio Grande. Yes, some of them come in that way. A lot of them come in by airport. A lot of them come in by ships. That's not the problem. The problem is the market that exists in the United States. You kill a market, the product flow stops. Anyway, President Trump repeated his menacing threat that he's not going to be doing it for very long, referring to Petro. So there's going to be an operation by the U.S. in Colombia, he was asked, on Air Force One. Trump's reply was blunt. Sounds good to me, yeah. So then Trump volunteered this. By the way, you have to do something about Mexico. Mexico has to get its act together. It's pouring in from there. We have to do something about it. Then he talked about the Mexican president, Mrs. Sheinbaum. He says she's a terrific woman, but continues to refuse my offers to send in U.S. troops, which he reports he has made in every single phone call he's had with her. Not believing that other countries care about their sovereignty, Trump claimed the Mexican president is refusing U.S. troops because she's a little afraid, because the cartels are running Mexico. Actually, he says, we've been asked to do it. Now, I need to point out the hypocrisy of that comment. The cartels are running. Who do you think's running America? Congress? The president? The judiciary? The military? No. It's the oligarchs. The oligarchs who tell the president who to put who where. The oligarchs who buy and sell Congress people, like there's so many cattle in a holding area in Wichita waiting for the processing of the meat. The cartels are running Mexico, he said. There's different kinds of cartels. We think of cartels related to drugs. There's a pharmaceutical cartel in this country. There's a big food cartel in this country. There's a military cartel in this country. And they're running this country. And the oligarchs that own them, or the majority shares on the marketplace, or the hedge fund operators in Manhattan, connected with the Bank of England. So when pushed on this, he changed the subject. He changed the subject from Mexico. Would you really attack Mexico? And he kind of changes the subject to Cuba. And he assured the reporters then, Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. He said the aid and the oil Venezuela has provided to Cuba has now been cut off. So they said, well, is the U.S. going to act there too? He said, I don't think we need any action. It looks like Cuba's going to go down for the count. This isn't who I voted for. I voted for a man who was going to close the border. Looks like he did it. Thank you, President Trump. I voted for a man who was going to stop the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. I knew then he couldn't do it, but at least it looked like he was intending on doing something. And now he's not stopping Biden's intent to take these long-range missiles to the Ukraine. I voted for a man who was going to end what was going on in Gaza, but instead initiated, along with one of the great war criminals of this planet, Netanyahu, an attack on Iran that President Trump said we completely obliterated him. Well, if he did, Why are they getting ready for a second attack on Iran? I can't support that. Oh boy. And a lot of this has come up in conversations with patients. And, we've been kind of busy through the holidays, and people who listen to the show who are patients just want to talk a little bit inside a treatment room when I'm working on them. And there's not a whole lot of time to do that. But I appreciate the fact that they try to keep up on these things. But I know that I've stepped on the toes of a lot of K-Talk listeners. The amount of people on the stream was larger at the beginning of the show than it is now, because I probably stepped on some more toes. But there is a growing split in MAGA. And there's a lot of MAGA, a lot of supporters in MAGA are very upset with what's going on. This isn't, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. It just, this isn't exactly what we were planning on getting. So I want to talk some more about this and some other things that are developing in the news along with this. I want to mention that the special that I was running in the clinic for NUCA, for what I do as a NUCA doctor, and you can get more information about that at jackstockwell.com. We filled up all the spots. And there are people who are asking, well, can you please continue it a little longer? We've been on vacation. We didn't hear about it earlier. Yeah, so we are. It's half off for K-Talk listeners. The initial fees are cut by 50%, which is considerable. I mean, it takes me a long time to be able to deliver the goods to somebody on their first visit. But we do. I don't care if you're in there for migraines and headache problems, what's called cervical instability, cervical dysphonia, all kinds of problems with the neck and the way the head sits on the neck and the shoulders, shoulder problems, radiating pain from the arms into the hands, pain in the middle of the back between the shoulder blades, low back pain, sciatica, all the basic structural types of problems, radiating pain into the legs. I don't let anybody leave until they can say, yeah, that definitely feels better. I'm walking differently. I feel taller. I feel straighter. I feel more upright. Then follow-up visits after that, which are a few, are very brief compared to that initial care. And so I can't just schedule everybody that wants to come in right away. We have to spread it out. And of course, it went past the deadline of December 31st. So I'm still offering that great discount for a little while longer, so those who felt like they were left out in the rain can come in and enjoy having their life turned back on. This young lady, 21 years old, a victim of a lot of abuse, of almost all kinds of abuse in her growing up years. Very shut down, very introverted, bent over, hair hanging down the front of her face. About a half an hour after I'd worked on her, she came out of the resting room and looked me in the face and said, "I feel alive." I said, "What do you mean by that?" "I just feel alive." Yeah, well, we kind of turned the nervous system back on. She had a lot of compression in the area of the brainstem where it transitions into the spinal cord. That's where my work is. That has a global effect on the entire body. And then a fellow yesterday back in for his first follow-up. A hard-working guy, works with his hands. He said, "Last night I had the best sleep I have had in years since I can remember." Yeah, that's kind of the effect of the work we do. So I want to get into more of what I've been talking about here, but I just wanted to mention that that's still going on. but you have to make an appointment that allows for an hour and a half up to 2 hours on the first visit. You would have to call the office, 801-523-1890, 801-523-1890, and we'll get you scheduled for a consultation. If you decide at the end of the consultation that what I do really isn't in your ballpark, we'll still be friends. There's no charge for the consultation. Or you can go to jackstockwell.com and schedule a consultation yourself, and then the girls will get back to you and tie something down more specific. All right, now, I talked to you about the attempt to kill Putin yesterday with 91 drones being fired at his residence in Novgorod, near Valdai, and how the investigators and all 91 were shot down. They either crashed or they were shot down. And in some cases, they weren't totally destroyed. Parts of them were left, like the black box thing on a crashed commercial plane. And in this material, what was the hardware of the guidance systems for these drones. And when you look at the motherboards of the guidance systems, they tell you all the navigational information that's coded on these boards, which the Russians were able to decode. And it showed where they came from, and it showed where they were aimed. And so they took these pieces to the American, what's the term? Not liaison, attaché, the American attaché in Moscow of the American military and President Trump, and said, here, despite what Western press is saying, here's the evidence that it was targeted at our president. You can have it and look at it and examine it yourself. So when President Trump was first informed that this attempt on Putin's life had taken place, he immediately called Putin and discussed it with him. And said, listen, Vlad, I just want you to understand we had nothing to do with this. Nothing whatsoever. Well, of course, they're using American satellites to fly this stuff. But he said we had nothing to do with it. Well, last night, President Trump, or the night before, speaking on Air Force One, said he does not believe that the Ukrainian drone attack on Russian President Vladimir Putin's residence in Novgorod actually happened. Even after talking to Putin about it. So he told reporters en route to Washington, D.C. from Florida. He said, I don't believe that strike happened. There's something that happened fairly nearby, but we had nothing to do with this. So when the media asked why he had previously condemned Kyiv, Trump said, well, that was the first time I heard anything about it, referring to his conversation on December 29th with Putin hours after the strike happened. Trump said, we don't believe that happened, as you know, now that we've been able to check, but it was the first we ever heard about it then. We just hope Russia and Ukraine get this settled. He comes out and he says, we don't believe that ever happened. That, of course, is what the West is saying. Well, the world now has kind of entered into a different phase that we were enjoying up until Christmas and New Year's because of the kidnapping of Maduro and the attack on Venezuela. Because it means that after all the other developments, like the ongoing genocide in Gaza in front of the world's public eye, the suppression of the freedom of speech growing in this country, the various other developments towards dictatorships, not in Russia or China, but actually in the West. We're now facing the literal breakdown of international order. Might makes right. Do you remember the movie Camelot with Richard Harris playing Arthur? And Arthur's sitting around contemplating the power that he represents and the army that he has and the knights who want to serve Arthur. And this is before the creation of the Round Table. And Richard Harris just played this part so well, he convinced me he was King Arthur. It is a musical. And he's sitting there in his throne chair, knees up to his chest, kind of looking off in the distance. Might makes right. Might makes right. And then he suddenly stops. Might for right, he says. Not might makes right. Might for right. Use the power of the army to establish rightness, not conquest. And here we are sinking more and more towards dictatorship. Trump has basically said that if the vice president of Venezuela is not doing what we want, she faces what would be much worse than what Maduro is facing. A rather unveiled threat. What is Maduro facing that she would be facing worse? Assassination? That was my first thought, because if Maduro is found guilty, and of course he's declared himself innocent, found guilty, I don't know if at Guantanamo or where, he'll spend the rest of his life. What's worse than that? So not excluding troops and boots on the ground, even if that is probably not the preferred solution, the interim government in Venezuela, or the remaining government, made statements that they are not capitulating, that they demand the release of Maduro and his wife. Well, that'll be determined in the next coming days and weeks, but it is clear that the main aim of the United States in what happened down there is to grab the oil and to kick out China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. That's the real threat to the Western, the American hegemony of the Western hemisphere, is the presence of these other countries who go in and build things, as opposed to us, the American hegemony that goes in and steals things. That's our history. That's the history of our foreign policy. You notice how we don't bother countries that don't have oil? So Marjorie Taylor Greene mentioned in her tweet the other day that the U.S. has in mind a second attack on Iran, which of course the Strait of Hormuz would be closed. Iran's already said that. There would be no more oil coming out of Iran. And Saudi Arabia will have trouble getting oil out of Saudi Arabia. And in which case, of course, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, so they would, and of course, controlling of the Venezuelan oil supplies. I don't think that the present output of Venezuelan oil could compensate for that entirely. But it's all up in the air. I think it was an unbelievable display of right. Might makes right instead of might. No, might is right. The current policy, the current American foreign policy, not might for right, but might is right. When you saw the press conference given by Trump, as I mentioned earlier, Rubio, Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Kane, it was unbelievable how they portrayed this picture, saying nobody can do anything against us. We have the most powerful military in the world, and of course that is what they clearly want to portray. But if that plays out in the long run, or even the short term, is entirely another question. This is the national security thing that just came out, playing out concretely, that the attitude of totally controlling the Western Hemisphere regarding all countries in the Americas as the United States' backyard, which clearly has implications for Argentina, Chile, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic. And Rubio made some ominous warnings himself about Mexico, Cuba, and Colombia should watch out. What does that mean? You better watch out. I just see a couple of bullies fighting one another in the halls of high school. Yeah, oh yeah. Well, you better watch out. That's what Rubio said, which was a blatant attack on President Sheinbaum of Mexico, because she also invoked the UN Charter yesterday at the security meeting. But that was really her only gripe. So it's kind of an unbelievable situation. This naked threat of force, total violation of international law. The liberal order is definitely defunct, and that creates a whole new situation in the world. And now it's interesting that Russian Senator Alexei Pushkov warned that the temporary triumph in Venezuela could turn into an utter disaster, like other military interventions before. He said previous presidents were delighted with American presidents, with their victories in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and they were all very eager to announce their victories, but ultimately, every one of these things turned into defeat, as in Afghanistan, or disaster, as in Libya and Iraq. So he said, what's going to be the result of Venezuela? Well, triumph turned into disaster. He said, now the expectation, obviously, is that the U.S. can move in and take over the oil. It's been reported that in the beginning of March, a large delegation of CEOs of the big U.S. oil corporations planning to go to Venezuela to start operations. Now, it remains to be seen by that time if the situation will be such that that's possible. But it's clear that is their intention. Now, the reactions to this around the world is extremely telling. I would think that the majority of people who have some sense of sovereignty and give it importance are all condemning it, including Hungarian President Viktor Orban, who otherwise is a supporter of Trump. He made a statement not only attacking Trump, but also saying this is a complete collapse of the international system. And then there's a lot of other interesting reactions. For example, German Chancellor Merz, absolutely unbelievable. He's twisting, saying the situation, what is going on? The whole situation is simply too large to judge. I mean, he's dancing around like this. He just threw international law in a garbage dump. Well, I can't really tell you one way or the other because it's just too big. The whole situation is just too big to give a fair and adequate judgment. Vadeful, the foreign minister of Germany, is not, he says it's not my place to judge this. He just gave out a travel warning for Germans to avoid Venezuela. Medvedev actually gave the most funny reaction by saying that by the same token, neo-Nazi Merz can now be taken out of Germany. This is rather amusing. The French farmers, by the way, are demanding now that Trump comes and gets Macron. So there's some humorous elements to this. Medvedev also said that the United States, after the attack on Venezuela, cannot even formally accuse Russia now of anything, including the events in the Ukraine. He said that it's very clear that the actual aim is to take the oil and their other raw materials, and so that this is a an example of the right of the stronger. Lex fortissimum, fortissimum, lex fortissimum, the right of the stronger. Naturally, there's a bunch of other reactions, and a lot of even the ADF in Germany, kind of the Trumpers of Germany, have a bunch of mixed stuff about this. But the big discussion in Europe as of this morning that I've been able to find is the follow-up in respect to Greenland, where Trump has now appointed a special envoy, namely the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, and Katie Miller, former member of the Trump administration. She's the wife of Stephen Miller. Put out social media contribution where she said that Washington will very soon take over Greenland. That's not what the founders had in mind. Then the Danish government said, as soon as they heard that from Katie Miller, that Denmark, they're going to increase their military and civil surveillance over Greenland, the Danish military. To which Trump said that Denmark just added another dog sled. Just total arrogance, President Trump. That's not befitting the president of my country. To compare the Danish military to just a dog sled. So the double standard is just overwhelming. There's a lot of commentaries about the double standard, but the unprovoked aggression is one thing in the Ukraine. It's a completely different thing in the Venezuela. So that's going on. You can expect more action in Venezuela. This isn't over with. Because if the present government is not complying with what Trump demands, there could easily be a second operation. Maybe even trying to take out the President Rodriguez, just put in yesterday, or some other thing. In any case, this is not over by any means, and more worrisome than that is the fact that this last Sunday, Trump corrected his judgment concerning the Ukrainian drone attack on the residence of Putin by saying, well, as I mentioned earlier, we don't believe that really happened. He told that to reporters on the Air Force One on the way back to Washington. In any case, this is more worrisome because it does reflect that one can almost say that the neocons have taken over. As I have said earlier in this program as to why I can't fully support Trump anymore, because the neocons have control of the White House, and that Trump's election promises to end the useless wars and not start new ones has been completely broken. And if you look at the press conference where Trump was surrounded by Hegseth and Rubio and General Kane, where Rubio went out of his way to say, this is a president who carries things out. He gets things done. Obviously trying to butter Trump up, but basically saying what the new policy is for now. Now, why did the Venezuelan government stand down? Why did the army? Why didn't the Venezuelan army put up a fight? Well, they could see what side their bread was buttered on, and they saw the massive air attack that was coming, and the ground attack if necessary. And so they just said, well, we kind of have an oath to defend this government, to defend our president and his wife, not his wife, but our president. But it's better to just not pick up any rocks today and get prepared to fight another day. Many of them paid off. You can bet that for sure. Venezuelan generals were paid off to stand down for this thing and let it happen. For promises of promotions, promises for payoff, promises for positions in the new government. Do I know that for sure? Of course not. But that's what's happened in the past with American foreign policy. So that there's only 80 people who were killed. who did not go home to their families that night. Well, that's going to do it for today, for today's program. Let me bring the recording to an end here. Boink. I'll save that as quickly as I can. Lowell, I assume you're back to take over at the top of the hour. Keep your wits about you. I've got a good health show lined up for you tomorrow, especially about the immune system and what you need to do to get through this super flu stuff that apparently is flowing around everywhere. My pleasure to be a part of the show this morning. For those of you who are on the stream, thank you for your attendance. If you would like and subscribe, it will help the numbers a lot.